Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about our show today. In our show today, I talk with my dear friends, Dr Abbott and Adam Sadowski. We discussed the new paper just published on the relationship of Hashimoto's thyroiditis and the AIP diet. But before we begin, let's hear a word from our sponsor. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Hey there, Dr. Alan Christensen here with you. I'd love to take just a moment and tell you about our Thyroid Advisor program. So what is the Thyroid Advisor visit? Well, imagine that one of your closest friends happened to be a thyroid doctor and that they understood the conventional, the naturopathic, and all the functional approaches. You know, they just wanted you to feel better and they were happy to video chat whenever you needed them. So that's basically it. Just click the link to set up a time and the IH docs are happy to help out today.
Hello everyone, super excited to be here with my friends, Dr. Abbott, and Adam Sadowski. Again, can't get rid of this dude. As previously teased, I wanted to have two of the primary investigators of the new AIP research study in relation to Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Rob and Adam, how are you guys?
Doing great, Dr. Ruiz. How are you?
Just sipping some coffee and drinking some water.
I'm doing really well myself. I mean, I wish I was with you guys in person.
Aww.
But, you guys live on that West Coast thing, so it's just, hard to make that work. Well, they say West Coast is the best coast.
Yeah, West Coast is the best coast, man. It's about time you move.
Adam's just been trying to convince me, but I'm also trying to convince him to move over here. So, it's just a constant battle, constant struggle.
But what's there for Adam on the East Coast? Family? You over here you have third wave roasters and awesome pop-up restaurants.
I mean, you win. You guys win.
Yeah, it's correct. But anywho, let's get deep into this study. So, Dr. Abbott, how did you get involved in this study? What was your interest, and how did you connect and decided that this would be a really good idea?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The reality is that the results are amazing. I think the story about the study is even more amazing, which is certainly saying something. The sort of medium length version of the story, way back in, I guess it was 2017, the first AIP IBD study came out. So first study looking at the AIP diet for inflammatory bowel disease. And I remember it came out in the Paleo sphere and got the article and read it and was reading it, line for line, and came across a section detailing the use of Angie Alt's cookbook and Nikki Trescott's book. And I don't know why it seemed so crazy to me that that's what it was. I didn't know the backstory that, yes, they had actually been working with Dr. Jetty on the study and all of the behind the scenes. I just saw that and was like, wow, they actually used their books to do the study. So I remember sending a message to Angie and Nikki at the time, who I connected with at the 2016 Ancestral Health Symposium, I think. I'd connected with them just prior to the study coming out, and then of course Nikki sent me a message like, "Yeah, Rob, what?" Of course this was like, "What? We know about this."
Yeah, they were part of the study.
They were part of the study, exactly. I didn't even read the acknowledgments. But yeah, so I thought it was amazing and just really great to start getting some scientific evidence behind, this was a small pilot, small group of people, but a pilot nonetheless, to get things off the ground, to bring more evidence and research behind the autoimmune protocol diet. And so I kind of connected with them again, and they ended up doing a survey of their followers so early that next year, and the biggest thing that they mentioned that they wanted was more research, more studies behind AIP. And so we sort of just kind of sat around. I was a resident at the time, towards the end of my first year, and I told them, I was like, well, I mean, I'll be more than happy to start writing articles for you guys, doing some research, and trying to bring a medical perspective to not like legitimize. I mean, that's giving myself too much credit, but it really elevates what we're doing and bringing a different perspective to autoimmune wellness, their collaboration. And so we talked about that, and then also, the crazy idea came into my head of, let's do another study, because I don't want to wait around for 5 more years for for another study to come out. Like, we should do this ourselves, not fully understanding all the pieces needed to pull off something like that, especially the key piece of getting money to do it. But I was like, heck, let's just do our own study, what's going to take. And at first it was kind of a crazy idea, but we sat down and, got together and started to put the pieces together and say, well, what do we really need to do this? And kind of put together a pilot framework. What disease were we going to study? How many people did we want to get? Was it going to be single arm, or a control group? And so designed a study. And I think over a week I stayed up, till 12 or 1 a.m., 5 or 6 nights in a row, writing up an IRB, which is essentially a protocol to give to an institutional review board to review, to make sure the study is sound from an ethical standpoint and is actually designed in a way that would find find something meaningful. And so I put up, 30-some page documents, and got connected with Adam, and I was like, hey, Adam, I think we're going to try to do this, and I love your thoughts on this IRB. And he provided some really great feedback, and we sort of tweaked things. Luckily, it's a low risk intervention, so I was able to kind of go through an expedited review process through my residency institution, which was awesome. I didn't have any added cost because I was a resident. And the other sort of hidden bonus of being at the place I was at, while it was academic affiliated program, residency program, was not like where I went to school at the University of Virginia, where it took me 9 months to get a protocol through an IRB just to get 12 medical students together to meditate and do a couple surveys. It was like the most ridiculous process. And so I was actually able to get through fairly quickly with some small revisions, this low risk protocol. I think it accepted, which in the research space, and maybe we'll get into some aspects of this. And Guillermo, you have a great understanding of this, having done quite a bit of research yourself. But that process can be somewhat laborious and very time consuming, but it was really nice to be able to get through it quite rapidly to then actually begin a more formal structure and to see where we're going to do this study once and for all. And so once I got the IRB through and it was approved, I realized I needed to make a budget based off of mainly the laboratory tests we were wanting to perform. And that was the big piece. And I put that all together. And I mean, there's a lot of other things I would have loved to do, but I sort of decided, well, what's the bare minimum, or just above the bare minimum, what we need to do from a lab testing standpoint, and put some numbers together, calculated a few things, and came up with a rough estimate of we needed about $11,000 to essentially cover the cost of the lab, cover the cost of the account to manage submissions in a HIPAA compliant way. Which, when you think about anyone else who probably understands the research process, is like, what? Like, only $11,000? Like, well, even these small pilot studies, have an entire staff of folks managing this study and interacting with participants. And you're talking about, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Adam and I were like, well, we're just going to do this essentially for free, because if we tried to get money to even compensate some tiny fraction of our time, it's just going to blow this thing out of the water. And we had no grant funding. We had no funding source. And what we had talked about was we have to get it from the community. And so in my mind was like, I don't know what's a reasonable number to ask. I've only had ever a few $1,000s in my bank account. So $12,000 seemed like an insane amount of money to ask of one person or an entire community. And so we sort of decided we can't take anything. In addition to this, we just need to try to raise enough money to cover the cost of the study. And so that's when I kind of went back to Mickey and Angie. I was like, hey, you guys have an amazing social media platform. We've really generated a lot of good communication and connection with some folks, especially since I come on board as a medical advisor. And I was like, hey, do you think we can raise this amount of money through a crowdfunding campaign? And Mickey was like, hell yeah, we can do that. And I was like, okay. And so went together and put up a crowdfunding campaign through Indiegogo and set up the different structures, recorded a little video, and put up this campaign, and then connected with folks like you, Guillermo, and different folks in the space to try to get their audience aware and willing to donate. And I kid you not, and it was like within the third week, we had raised $12,000. And I still am just like, I mean, I think about 100 different people donated anything from $5 to $500. And it blows my mind that a community was like, hell yeah, I'm going to support something that is meaningful and a research project. And when there's no guarantee that the study's going to show anything meaningful, and I say meaningful, saying it could have said this doesn't work at all, and that would quote be meaningful, or we see some really good results, and that quote be meaningful. But there was no guarantee of anything, and people were willing to share their money and donate to creating evidence behind something that perhaps a lot of them had a benefit from in their own life.
Yeah, and it's so powerful because, within the community, we talk about community within the Paleo sphere or, the ancestral movement, and put up or shut up, and it happened. And that is just fantastic because there are not a lot of companies out there that would be interested in an intervention that basically is don't eat like an idiot. It's difficult to monetize that. So when you have something like that has deeply affected people's lives for the better, of course people are going to want to jump in and try to help. So before we go into the meat and bones of the study, Adam, can you explain the difference between like a definitive study or a pilot study or the different levels of evidence and why this study is so important?
So if you kind of think, for a lot of people, you can just sort of Google pyramid of level of evidence, and it'll kind of tell you sort of an overview as to sort of like what's the preferred, at the top of the food chain are your systematic reviews with meta-analyses. Those are, supposed to be the most impactful, most strongest evidence for either intervention or whatever the study is examining. And then at the bottom of the totem pole is sort of like, case reports or anecdotal evidence. So like a case report is kind of like, someone writes up about who they wrote for their patient, and this is what happened, and they got better, and it's a very low-grade level of evidence. With our study, we did what's called a pilot study, and pilot studies are basically kind of like a rough draft of future studies. And the whole purpose of a pilot study is kind of to get the ball rolling and kind of put your idea that you have out there, your hypothesis out there, and to kind of see what needs to be modified in future studies and kind of just sort of test, can we even replicate this? Can we even do this study on the low-level scale? Is our question reasonable? Is the way we attracted participants reasonable? Is the way we funded money reasonable? And, was the intervention we did even possible? Were people safe throughout the study? Things like that. And then from there, you can kind of modify your study design for a more robust study, such as a double-blind, placebo-controlled study in which both the researcher and the participants or the participants and somebody delivering the treatment don't know who's getting what treatment. And that works really well in sort of kind of like a pharmaceutical or nutraceutical type of setting where you want to see, does this drug or does this nutraceutical have an effect on something that you're looking for? And what you would do in that sort of situation is, both pills will look exactly alike, taste exactly alike, feel exactly alike, and the only person that knows essentially who's getting what would be the researchers at the end of the study once they figure out who got what once the study was completed. So this way, there's no sort of bias as to perhaps you wanted to see some sort of result, so you gave the people you think would have the best results these pills or placebos or whatnot. But with our study, we weren't able to do that just because we wanted to see, can we even carry out the autoimmune paleo protocol over a 10-week period in these individuals?
And within the double-blind placebo control, there's other things that as humans, we are unable to control. Like, for example, what if this patient is getting the intervention or the treatment and your intake or your interaction with them is completely different than someone that is not taking the treatment. So it puts different levels of barriers to make sure that the bias is at a minimum. Even though, even in double-blind placebo control tests, there's a study about this kid who was, basically unresponsive in the emergency department, and The doctors didn't know what was going on. The lab values were all, normal. And they found out that he was part of this research experiment. And one of the investigators came over to see him and informed him that he was on the placebo group. And after learning this information, this kid just woke up and he was like, oh, I feel better. Yeah, I'm going to totally link this study because it is phenomenal. Even within a double-blind placebo-controlled study, there can be bias. And that's why we look at meta-analysis where you look at different double-blind placebo controls and pilot studies and all of that, and you try to come up with the best hypotheses as to what happened. And we're far from that when it comes to dietary interventions because humans are difficult. We live very fluid lives and we don't calculate for a lot of things such as sleep or connection, familial or community connections, and even like calorie intake or quality of food, or there's so many variables. So you have to start somewhere. And this is going to be like the foundation of hopefully bigger and better studies to try to tease out how diets affect autoimmune disease.
Every study is flawed in some capacity, and you have to understand sort of the purpose of what that study is, the type of study that's being done, the methods being used, and kind of understanding what the authors are trying to ask or what are they trying to test, and kind of take the study, as it is, rather than kind of viewing every single study as the same. So a pilot study has a purpose. A randomized controlled trial has a purpose, and each different type of study has their own purpose, and from there you can then build upon that.
What was the design of the study?
Essentially, in trying to figure out what was going to be the best way, and pilot study is still a broad umbrella term. You can design pilot studies in any number of ways. And as you mentioned earlier, it's very difficult most people are not interested in multifaceted lifestyle interventions because it's essentially impossible to control and say, was it the connection? Was it the sleep? Was it the diet? Was it the
Rob Abbott's sweet voice?
Is it, for the practical clinician, we sort of look at that and say hogwash because at some level we know enough that these are the key elements, lifestyle elements that restore wellness and maintain wellness. So to some degree, I don't particularly care to know, was it 25% better sleep in that person and 35% diet in that person and whatever. I just want to know what can practically be done in real life. And so that brings up another point of how do you design a study? Do you put everyone in a hospital ward and control everything about their life to try to control all the variables? Or do you do it in a freestanding, free living human beings who are making choices on their own, grocery shopping on their own? That provides, to me, much more real world evidence as to how well will something work, because something that might work in a hospital when everything's controlled and someone's cooking for you and doing this and that may not work at all in the real world. And you could have just wasted tons of money doing a silly study in a controlled environment that's just not real life. And so we decided we wanted to try to replicate as much of a real world scenario as possible, as well as build off the structure of the original AIP IBD study, which I think this is probably one of the most important points to get is that study, although they didn't really communicate it as well in the study, our study was not a diet study. And, let me explain, why that is. So our study was not simply looking at a diet. It was looking at a multidisciplinary, multifaceted lifestyle intervention, as I've been alluding to with all of these other elements. So we actually cannot say, following the study, what cause people to have benefit, what caused people to maybe not have benefits. We really cannot say because of the inherent confounding of the study design, but it was a multifaceted lifestyle intervention that was based off of a program by Angie All that she's been using for several years now called SAD to AIP in 6, where she takes individuals in a community group setting with the support of nutritionists and health coaches through a phased elimination diet to essentially get to AIP by week 6. And then in the case of our study, we wanted to take people through that 6 weeks and then maintain them for an additional 4 weeks, essentially resulting in a 10-week intervention. But within there and within her program is education about sleep, education about stress management. In the case of our intervention, there was interaction with myself as a medical provider with individuals at 3 different time points, at the beginning, at week 6, and at the end. So individual interaction there, community interaction between the individuals in the group themselves and with the health coaching team. So as you can see, there's tons of elements. And I really wanted to, designing the study, I wanted to have obviously this interventional arm. I really also wanted to have a control arm to do, as Adam was sort of alluding to, could you control to some extent the expectancy or placebo response? Could you control for people, just getting better based off of, oh, I know I'm in this group, AIP diet, people do that and get better. Is there a way that we could have done a control group? And the basic design for an intervention like this is using something called a wait list control, or some form of wait list where people just get education. It's one of the best ways to do an intervention and actually maintain expectancy, because if someone's on a wait list, they know they're still going to get a program or get to participate in something. It just won't be in the moment that the intervention group is. But the only problem with that was, in order to have that group equal size with the intervention group, the size that we wanted, we would have to do labs on them too. And that was going to double the cost of the study, which, looking back now, we totally could have raised that money. But it was the first time ever asking, how much, I didn't know how much money we could get from the community and what was even reasonable to ask. So I decided to fall back on the original single arm design from the AIP IBD study and do that for our group, knowing that we will, if we showed efficacy here, be able to show people, hey, this seems to be a good study design. People got some benefit, and we think we can replicate this on a larger scale. And then do that second study where maybe we get 100 people in total. We put 50 in an intervention, a similar intervention, and 50 in a waitlist or waitlist education group. And that way you can have a direct comparison over the same time period between people in 2 groups and start to extrapolate, what was someone's experience who didn't get the intervention versus someone who did during the same time point. And you can make a lot better, not better necessarily, but more targeted conclusions, and it'll be more robust because the size is larger, but also because of that control element. So I kind of went off on a tangent there, but essentially bringing it back, I wanted just to do a single arm. We ended up getting 17 people, so somewhere between 15 and 20 people. We got 17, and they all had to meet certain specifications. So in doing research, and Adam could talk about this too, it's important to identify a population that you want to study and not necessarily be so broad in the beginning. Now, Hashimoto's thyroiditis affects hundreds of thousands of individuals, so it's a huge population, but it disproportionately affects Caucasian, middle-aged white women and women in general because of its autoimmune nature. And so it made sense for us to, in thinking about the most applicable group, the most generalizable group, to look at middle-aged women. And we really wanted to ensure, too, that we didn't get women in perimenopause or postmenopause who could have an element of hormonal disturbance or hormonal difference that could be impacting their symptoms. And so we decided to set the age cutoff between 20 and 45, knowing that, you could still have issues before 45, but to try to minimize that. And working with the women, it did seem like essentially everyone was in a premenopausal state, so hormonal fluctuations around menopause or after menopause were not an issue or a variable that could impact things. So yeah, we wanted to make sure we had not a super wide population, but also not an incredibly narrow population, because as I even put in a series of articles I'll be publishing over the next few weeks about the limitations of the study, one of my pet peeves in research is that researchers can embed selection bias into their inclusion and exclusion criteria. So those are the fancy terms for who gets to be a part and who can't be a part. And so if you make your inclusion exclusion criteria extremely specific, it can look on the surface as, well, that's just the design of the study. But it's sort of a hidden way to be really selective. And what happens a lot of times is people do that to get really, really sick people so that their intervention looks more powerful, because some fraction of those really sick people will probably just get better on their own or return to an average state. And so I didn't want to have any elements of potential selection bias where we said you have to have a minimum antibody level of 500 or 700.
Or a TSH that is 4 or 5.
Correct. So we actually, all I required of people was a medical history of Hashimoto's and evidence from a previous lab test of some abnormal antibody level. And through that, we were actually able to get a couple women who were not on medication, but had, so not true hypothyroidism requiring medication replacements, but had elevated antibodies. So we had a couple of those women. We also had, and then the rest of the women were on replacement medication. But in keeping it broad there, we actually were able to get a couple women who were technically Hashimoto's, but didn't yet need medication. And so, but I wanted to make it broad because I didn't want to just suddenly get everyone with antibodies over 1,000, and then we see some effect of antibodies drop, and it's like, well, maybe that was just because they were really, really high in the beginning,
and they were about to drop regardless.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, to go back to your, to multiple arm study, it would be even carrying something out like that would be difficult because people in our space are doing some dietary modification or lifestyle modification. Maybe they are biohackers and they're tracking their sleep and their HRV, and they are going carnivore, or they are, not eating grains or adding MCT. So it's not like a regular person who might be eating a standard American diet. So that makes it more even harder for us to find, the causality of the disease process. But take me through the study. Take me through the actual interventions. Like, what does the 6-week program look like?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Adam, you can jump in. So essentially, and you brought up a good point I'll get into as well about, who did we actually end up getting in the study. So in doing the social media campaign, 1, to crowdfund it, and 2, to find participants, we were obviously, looking at people who were aware of AIP, had either heard about it or had been at least connected with it. And one of the exclusion criteria was essentially not having followed the diet for more than 30 days. So essentially finding people who were either aware of it and hadn't done it or were completely unaware of it. And it turned out, in doing questionnaires for the folks that got enrolled, that almost everybody had heard of it and was either following autoimmune wellness, following AIP blogs, but hadn't been able to do it on their own. So basically showing, and what my clinical experience and probably your clinical experience has shown, Guillermo, this is a really hard diet to do on your own, even in the most motivated setting, especially if someone wants to, cold turkey say, yeah, I'm going to just suddenly follow AIP, get rid of all this food and do this overnight and do it for 2 months without any slip-ups. I mean, that's just like, I can't count the number of people I've opened up my hand who've done that. And so the program was obviously targeting people who were aware of AIP. And some people criticized the study saying, well, it's a popular diet. But as you kind of alluded to, we wouldn't want to get someone who didn't believe that this would work. I mean, that's like, especially from a lifestyle standpoint, it's silly to force someone. You can't force someone to do something that they don't want to do. And it's not generalizable and practical to apply. So we obviously wanted people who believed in it or had a willingness to make changes. And so that's an important point to make when you realize to the study that this was about women. We ended up getting 17 women who wanted to make changes in their life. It was not taking a new supplement or taking a new drug or someone saying, do this and cracking a whip. It was people doing this on their own. And so the first week was just a preparation week. And Angie's program is really just getting acclimated to the online group, interacting in the Facebook community with each other, and getting to know the study team. And we had to do some run-in labs as well the week prior. So it was really just getting acquainted and getting prepared, knowing that you have to get your environment in the right place. And as you do something like this, if you have garbage around your house, you're still going to eat that. You have to help the environment. will the environment help you? And so there was a lot of preparation in the beginning, and then from there was gradual elimination. So the next week was, eliminate grains and alcohol, and then another week would be eliminating dairy, and then in between there was small lifestyle goals that might look at sleep hygiene or incorporating a meditation practice. And I met with everyone individually in the beginning to go over their baseline thyroid labs and to ensure that everyone was able to get the nutritional testing and the stool testing performed. And so that was sort of the structure of the first 6 weeks, was essentially eliminating different food groups with the idea that you eliminate the most likely to be problematic and least nutrient-dense foods in the beginning, and then saving the foods that are least likely to be problematic and most nutrient-dense foods to be eliminated at the end, knowing that in this scenario, it's not about the food being, quote, good or bad. People are going to be eliminating things like eggs and nuts and seeds, which on paper you're like, oh, that's a really good food. Well, potentially in this context, it might be problematic, and I can't really predict of the people in the group who's going to respond negatively to that or didn't need to eliminate that food. And so it's a fairly standardized elimination diet, but doing it in this gradual manner and doing it in the community, it radically improves adherence and people's willingness to do something that they otherwise couldn't do on their own or wouldn't have been willing to try because they didn't have a recipe or they didn't have a health coach guiding them through that or community to reach out to. And so it was just phenomenal to see and watch as kind of a bystander these women interact and make these changes through those first 6 weeks.
And Adam, so what kind of lifestyle interactions were they applying?
Yeah, so the lifestyle interaction that we were doing with them was we were just kind of giving them tips for improving their sleep, like sleep hygiene. We were giving them, as Rob was alluding to earlier, dietary recommendations and different habits and how to shop at a grocery store and prepare meals. Gave them some meditation exercises and kind of just stress-reducing stuff, not necessarily meditation, but yoga, just kind of helping, just kind of like basic naturopathic stuff that Guillermo, Dr. Ruiz, you and I do to, patients that we're seeing, where we're talking to them about, yoga and meditation and just kind of reducing their stress burden on their life and just sort of increasing movement and exercise and stuff like that.
So within all of this, were they logging into a website or were they getting one-on-one education? You mentioned health coaches. What was that interaction? What would a subject in the study would have experienced had they been part of it?
Basically, at the start of the study, they filled out some questionnaires, kind of filling out some information that we were trying to gather from before the study and after the study. And then once the study started, they basically met almost daily with one of the health coaches there, and were able to talk to them about sort of what their struggles were and what they needed to do. They had a private Facebook group, I believe, where they were able to sort of use it as a social community to kind of talk about what they were struggling and what was helping and sort of what they were going through on a day-to-day basis. And we know that social gatherings do make an impact on health. We know that, if you look at the Mediterranean diet, it's not necessarily just a diet or just the lycopene content of tomatoes, for example. It could be the fact that a lot of people are eating together and moving together and are out in the sun. So not necessarily just a Mediterranean diet, but sort of this overall lifestyle. And that's kind of what we were implementing with this. And that, they were logging food onto, I believe it was Chronometer, which is sort of like a daily log that they can use to, you look up a food and you put in the amount that you're eating and it kind of gives you this nutritional profile to it. And then they were able to share that with the health coaches to kind of make any sort of adjustments or improvements, take in a food and take out a food or add more of this, et cetera, with the health coaches.
It would be very interesting to have data on the nutritional density of the diet during the protocol and before the protocol. But, we'll get into that later. Okay, so we've gone through the design. We talked a little bit about the hypotheses and then the design. And then what are the results? And then we're going to end with the conclusion and limitations. So kind of like a paper and how you dissect a paper. So what were the results?
Yeah, so, what we were looking at was we were looking at a marker known as the SF36, also, which is just short form 36, and that's just a quality of life questionnaire. We looked at what's called the MSQ, and that was sort of like a functional medicine form of quality of life, but looking at a couple different parameters to that. And then we also looked at weight, BMI, and sort of just thyroid markers. And then we also kind of did some assessments of sort of what the gut microbiota composition looked like through stool testing. And we looked at just an overall CMP and CBC, so just kind of some basic lab markers that we would look at. And we saw, or I guess Rob has a little bit more to say on the results, so I'll leave that up there.
And going back to those hypotheses of what were we trying, what the questions that we were asking, a priori, before we did this study, what were our hypotheses? And having worked with people clinically and seeing results from Angie's group, we predicted before enrolling anyone that we hope to see improvements in quality of life as participating in the program. And that quality of life questionnaire is a pretty robust questionnaire that has domains of emotional health, mental health, physical health. So it has good categories. So you get a better understanding of what domains, when someone says their quality of life improves, there's other domains in there that give you a better idea of, for each individual, what was the main driver. And then that other questionnaire, the MSQ, was a very helpful symptom questionnaire. It's not yet technically validated. It hasn't really been used enough in research. It's a great clinical tool that I find, and has been used in the Institute for Functional Medicine from Dr. Jeffrey Bland to really get a better sense of someone's symptom burden and what types of symptoms. And it's an objective tool, so you get a raw number out of it. And so we wanted to ask, could someone's quality of life improve? Would their symptom burden, as measured by this MSQ, decrease as a result of the intervention? And then we expected to see improvements in thyroid markers, as in decreases in antibodies and less need for medication, which could either be a result of losing weight or improvements from the lifestyle intervention itself. So before we did the study, that was some of our main hypotheses and why we were using certain lab markers. I didn't have an a priori hypothesis about this, but I wanted to include inflammation, an inflammatory marker, at least in some fashion. And so high sensitivity CRP, or C-reactive protein, is a pretty sensitive. It's a very non-specific marker. It doesn't tell you, what tissue or what's really going on. But it's a really sensitive marker that can be used as a marker of inflammation. It's really been studied more specifically in cardiovascular disease and some other autoimmune diseases such as IBD. They actually measured CRP in that study. They didn't find anything statistically significant because there was massive variation in individuals, just massive standard deviations, although there was a little bit of clinical significance. And so I wanted to use an inflammatory marker to see, would something go up or down as a result of the intervention. But I didn't really have a priori hypothesis that we would see a decrease across the group. Interestingly, the other marker that I looked at, Adam mentioned the CMP, just a metabolic profile. You can't make any hypotheses from that. That was really just for safety. Making sure people's kidney function were fine and electrolytes were fine. Just going back to, we want to show this intervention is not killing people's kidneys or causing liver damage.
But you could check to see if liver function improved or if kidney function improved.
Yeah, you technically could. We were enrolling people with normal function in the beginning. So, you start with normal. It's kind of hard to get normal to better or see changes. So I don't want to get back to a priori. I didn't have a hypothesis, and I wasn't using, that wasn't any of my secondary, wasn't a true secondary marker. I wasn't trying to look at, what did AST do, but really using it in individual cases to make sure people's electrolytes in the beginning were fine, their kidney function, liver function were fine. And if they weren't, we would make changes within the study parameters to ensure that they were safe.
Yeah, but because God knows that eating all that meat is going to kill your kidneys.
People say that. And then the other marker that I put on there too, which was exploratory, and I'll also explain why it's almost a silly marker, even in the most controlled setting, to use to say and have an hypothesis about. But we measured vitamin D, and people are probably really familiar about vitamin D just because it's everywhere. It's in autoimmunity, it's in cancer, it's in all this stuff. And but going back to the number of variables, we make vitamin D by being in the sun. So it is almost impossible, even if you kept everybody in a hospital with the same exposure, to have any helpful way of saying, vitamin D went up or down, because just, having one person be in the sun 15 minutes more a day than someone else, that's drastically going to change their vitamin D level. So doing any kind of intervention, even if it's a supplement with that degree of variation, in my opinion, is don't look at those studies. They're just useless. And there's been a couple that have showed vitamin D higher vitamin D status, decreased antibodies. I'm just like, that's a bunch of nonsense. Like, there's so many variables. It's just poor study design. But I wanted to include it because of from an exploratory standpoint, but also in my clinical experience, and you've probably seen this too, Guillermo. People like taking vitamin D, and they often like taking a lot of vitamin D, and they like to keep taking it. And they don't often check their vitamin D level, or they don't check their calcium level. So in my experience, knowing the type of people we were going to get in the study or what I was expecting to get, I knew we would probably see people's vitamin Ds. They've been told, oh, you have autoimmune disease. You need to keep it in the 70s, 80s, which is just not supported by the literature or from an ancestral understanding. And so I included that. And sure enough, there was a number of women who were in the 70s to 90s, and one person who was frankly hypercalcemic, so a true hypervitamin D, hypervitaminosis D, and had elevated calcium because of the high vitamin D, and a couple other women that were just borderline. And so I was able to, in the beginning, get them to either stop or drastically decrease their vitamin D supplementation because it was unsafe. And I'm actually really glad now that I included that, because I would have maybe missed that was something to be aware of. And so some people might even feel like, man, you had people stop vitamin D and they still saw improvements. Well, yes, like this is not the single thing that's driving the boat. But coming back once again, that was a bit of a ramble to what we really wanted to study, those thyroid markers and the quality of life. When we looked at folks at the 10-week mark, at their quality of life, the scales used have their, and Adam did these calculations, the scores themselves kind of put onto a scale so you can better visualize them on a 100-point scale. And every domain, there's 8 domains, were a little bit different. The ones that were most impacted in the beginning were vitality, which is essentially energy, was very, very low in our population. Mental health suffered, general health suffered, some physical health parameters suffered. But when we looked at the data from after 10 weeks, every single domain of that SF-36 of quality of life improved, not only clinically, but statistically. And it's important to make that point because it's another one of my pet peeves is people do research and they're like, they find something with a p-value less than 0.05 and they're like, oh man, statistically significant. This is so awesome. But then when you look and see what actually happened, well, maybe their hemoglobin A1C, a marker of blood sugar, went down from 6.3 to 6.0, and it was a statistically significant finding for their intervention. I look at that and say, that's almost irrelevant clinically.
Yeah, you could have skipped, a meal for a couple of weeks and that's it. Or you could have gone, you could have gone and do a blood donation and then your A1C drops by that statistical significance.
And that nuance is really hard for the lay person, even myself, to tease out if you're just reading a news headline or reading even an abstract. And it's a pet peeve of mine for clinicians, well, not so clinicians, but scientists in some of the research to make it seem like something was so meaningful because it was statistically significant when it was clinical nonsense or it's like, just didn't do anything. Another, good examples, some of these questionnaires of quality of life or different symptom scales, we've quantified pretty well what any difference, what a true clinical difference of, this score versus this score is. There's a lot of drug trials in depression that have showed, improvements, statistical improvements in these questionnaires. But when you look at it, it's like that basically went from like feeling kind of blah to like maybe slightly less than blah, slightly more than blah. This is like not scientific terms, but once again, getting at the point that there's a big difference between clinical and statistical significance. But in this case, we saw across these markers clinical and statistical significance. And we're talking about p-values and, very, very small p-values. So high certainty that the intervention that we had was associated and related to the effects that we were seeing in these domains. And the biggest ones were in vitality, in general health, and some of the physical health parameters. And interestingly enough, we even saw benefits in bodily pain when you sort of cross-reference those with those MSQs, which had more specific questions about joint pain, muscle pain, this kind of stuff. There were some pretty significant improvements in joint and muscle pain, so musculoskeletal pain. And that's a huge deal in this day and age where opioid use and even chronic NSAID use, chronic ibuprofen, naproxen, these types of things, and folks that have chronic pain, we have to come up with better solutions. And you could say one of the conclusions we talked about in the study was that we saw improvements in bodily pain, showing that this lifestyle intervention, including AIP, could improve pain scores so that potentially people need less medication and you're not having to rely on NSAIDs or opioids. And that's a big deal right now because opioids are a big problem, especially when they interact with other medicines too. So
you're getting ahead of yourself. We're not talking about results yet or conclusions.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped ahead.
We're dude. My pet peeve of mine is people talking about conclusions in the results. You should be unbiased, as writing papers 101 tells you.
Gosh, I got too excited, Dr. Ruiz. But yeah, so we saw the statistical and clinical improvements in DESA 36. We saw statistical and clinical improvements in the symptom questionnaire, the MSQ. We saw the average in the beginning. I don't have the number exactly off the top of my head, but it was somewhere in the 90s. I mean, very high. And at the end, it came down to somewhere in the 20s. And it's like a golf score. You want a low score. You don't want a high score. So a massive clinical improvement. And when you look at some of the individuals, some people started out like 112 and came down to 6, came from 90 to, I mean, it was nuts. And I would, in thinking about, and we can talk about this more in the conclusions and speculation, but I was like, well, maybe one person will have a radical improvement. But it was not just one person. When you looked at this group level, it was just dramatic improvements. But when you looked at the thyroid markers, and to be honest, while we did have that a priori hypothesis of seeing improvements in thyroid function such that people would need less medication, we did not see on the group level any changes in TSH or hormone levels or antibodies. But in order to really sort of explore the nuance behind that and why, we didn't see any changes. Oh, well, it didn't work. The average TSH in the beginning was around 2, which is actually pretty dang good for a group, even a small group, with varying TSH. Some people's TSH were too low, some were a little bit high, but a TSH around 2. So I'd be really hard-pressed to, once again, starting at a fairly normal TSH to, over that short period of time, have actually seen across the group level a significant decrease in TSH. The same thing could be sort of said about the antibodies. Once again, getting back to that selection bias, I didn't want to pick people with antibodies of 1,000 to see a drop and not be able to really say, was that our intervention or was that just because they started out really high? And so the average TPO antibodies, thyroid peroxidase antibodies at the beginning, were just above 200, which clinically, and Guillermo, you probably have way better insight on this because this is what you do day in, day out. Clinically, I see that as like a win. If I can get someone down to like 200, I don't really see that.
Any drop in antibodies is a huge win.
If someone's down to around 200, I don't see it correlate really well to like symptoms. And so the way to explain that is, someone with antibodies of 300 versus antibodies of 50, I don't always see that the 300 person is way worse off than the 50 person. And a great example was even in our own study. We had one person who.
You're talking about about conclusions again.
No, this is results.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, she had previously elevated antibodies, but when she started, they were normal. They stayed normal, but she reported some of the worst symptoms. So basically showing me that, we can't just go off of, your antibodies are 300, you must be doing awful, or, because you've seen people probably freak out.
Or they're not, they're non-existent, now you're in remission.
But they feel terrible.
But they feel terrible because antibodies are very unpredictable, especially because you're making antibodies to a gland that is inside your body. So unless you remove that gland completely, it's very difficult to have those antibodies at zero. Again, there's a lot of misinformation within hypothyroid. And people kind of like freak out and, really look at antibodies. And the only clinical significance that I've found in the literature is for people who are trying to get pregnant. That's about it. And this is a great segue to conclusions because there was a really cool story coming out of that study, wasn't it?
I'm glad you point that out, and I'm glad you've seen that in your clinic because, once you get a diagnosis, like once you've done antibodies, you're like, okay, I have Hashimoto's. Like, they're oftentimes, unless it's really, really high and you want to make sure it's starting to come down, there's just no utility in tracking that. And I'm sure you've had patients pressuring you to like, I want to check my antibodies. Like, well, if it stayed the same but you felt better, why are we doing this? And if it didn't, you're going to start feeling back to that, like that guy in the study who like thought he was on a drug and having all this bad issue. And then when someone told him, oh, you're not on it. Oh, I'm good. you can have a nocebo response where someone, sees their antibodies and they're still elevated and they forget they started to feel better and they're like, oh no, I should feel like crap because my antibodies are. So I'm really glad you've seen that. And yes, we had an individual towards the end of the study who came in with some infertility issues. She got pregnant and so had to, sadly, quote, air quotes, drop out of the study because of our limitations on pregnant women. And it was so great to see her announce the news in the group too, and see that once again, like communal setting. And I was really happy to see that for her and to have her able to go on and carry this child. So the only person who didn't finish the study, we had to, quote, kick out because she got pregnant. Oh man.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool exclusion.
Yeah, I was pretty happy, and Adam can talk about that. I wasn't sure how many people were going to finish, even in this supported community setting. I didn't think everyone would finish the study because they had to do blood work, they had to do stool tests, they had to do nutritional tests. It's a hard diet, and maybe they didn't want to be a part of it anymore. But these women did it, man. They really did it.
So Adam, what are some cool things that you dug out of the study for your conclusion side of the story?
We were able to answer the question that we proposed, in that, is this protocol efficacious? Are we able to do this? Basically, were we able to do this? And the answer to that was yes, we were able to do this. We retained a good chunk of the starting population. We had one participant drop out because she got pregnant. And even though that might be viewed as a negative thing, if she was trying to get pregnant, then that's a good thing. She was able to get, what she wanted out of a lifestyle intervention. And this is good that it's efficacious, because it means that now we have some small evidence to suggest that this can be done in a more sort of like robust setting, if you will, and that we can start playing around more with it and say, okay, is it just the diet? Is it just the communal aspect to it? Was it just checking in with the health coaches all the time? So it is good to conclude that this was efficacious. However, we also have to do our due diligence to say that this can't just be applied broadly to everybody.
The scientist in me, has some curiosity about what was it that changed those markers that improved the quality of life. The clinician in me doesn't give a fuck. It really doesn't matter to identify the one thing, as long as it is something that can be done in mass, something that is not super ultra expensive and restrictive, and something that people can follow and get some benefit out of it. We were talking on our last podcast about why are we so hyper focused when maybe using a little bit of Nature-Droid or Terracent or Cytomel or whatever, plus eating an autoimmune paleo protocol, plus having a group of friends on Facebook and a health coach and whatever, it doesn't matter what the one thing is, as long as people are getting better. And sometimes people complain that functional medicine can be elitist, or that it's difficult to find a practitioner, or, well, what about trying this, doing it for, the 6 weeks or 10 weeks and see how you feel? It's something that anyone can do, no matter where you are, no matter, your monetary or financial limitations, and really have some improvement on your quality of life. And to me, that is fascinating. And this is the point where we need to kind of, again, pass the hat around, get people that are interested in functional medicine or the paleo community or the ancestral community or the keto community, and get more people to either volunteer or maybe data analysts that can look at other markers, or data mine the hell out of this pilot study and see how we can continue growing and advancing science. Super awesome what you guys did. Rob, any things that you dug out and that you found interesting? I know you guys were at a conference and you were working on the statistical analysis until really late.
Yeah, so actually I was so lucky to get to go to Portland where, Adam lives, and I told him before I came, I was like, we've been working on this virtually. We need to just own this right now, do the stats, do this paper, get it into the peer review process. And so we worked really hard for a couple of days.
Yeah, we actually, Dr. Ruiz, we actually set up shop in the heart, and we just basically from opening until, Rob had to go to a presentation, or basically when the coffee shop opened until it closed, we were just kind of there and just doing, our statistical analyses and writing up our results and conclusions and whatnot.
Yeah. So some of the really cool things that, I found was, so 13 of the 16 women who finished were on medication in the beginning, and 6 of them decreased their medicine. 2 of them actually had a decrease at the beginning, but then even had to decrease medication again because TSH was still suppressed, or they still had hyper symptoms at the end of the study. And then 4 other women, decreased their medication. So 6 out of the 13 women who were on medication decreased meds. And what's even more fascinating is when you look, and you're probably really aware of this, thyroid is typically dosed, or replacement is typically dosed off of someone's weight, at least in the beginning, but then this can be maintained. So if someone loses a bunch of weight, they'll need less medication. There was a woman who lost no weight, stayed her same weight. She was normal weight in the beginning, and her TSH dropped, and she needed less medication. So I was like, well, damn, I don't really have my weight argument as a way, or weight explanation to explain why your TSH drops and you need less medication. And then there was another woman who in the beginning was only taking T3, which I don't recommend.
Not a fan at all.
Yeah. Just not a fan. Her T4, we were talking about this before. It was essentially non-existent. Her free T4 was 0.2 or something. No T4. So her thyroid was suppressed. Her thyroid was making no T4, and I had recommended changing her from her physician there to get on a combination at least, or a T4 medication, and so I wasn't going to be able to include her in the group analysis because of that that change, or what I thought was going to be a change. I get her labs back, and we start talking at the last study point, and I see she's got T4 in the bottom end of the normal range. And so I was like, so what did you end up choosing? Was it Nutrithread or Armour? She's like, oh no, I started taking a little bit less T3, but I still haven't taken any T4. And I was like, okay. I also don't have an explanation. Is this all just from a suppressed thyroid? You're taking a little bit less T3 now, and now suddenly you're making T4, or was this intervention giving you the ability to make T4 again? And there was another woman too, a couple women who didn't technically decrease their medication, but potentially might have to, because they dropped from TSHs in the 4s to around 2. So it had a significant drop. They just started higher rather than starting lower. And one of them, they only lost, I think 5 pounds or something. And so once again, I couldn't explain all that to weight. And so one of the things I didn't want to be too speculative in the paper, but what I think about is, was some of these effects we were seeing in this 10, 12-week period related to not just weight loss and even sort of secondary beneficial effects of weight loss, but was this intervention truly improving the thyroid function? And so when you looked at the individual level, even though we didn't see anything at the group level, we were seeing improvements in the thyroid hormone and people needing less medication. And I just think that's amazing, because I come back to what you said earlier, if something's working, I want people to do it. And I want something as well as a clinician. If someone comes in with a symptom burden that's pretty high, like the majority of these women, I don't always know where to start. What do you focus on? Do I need to do this testing? And so this intervention afterwards knocks down a lot of the noise, so that, and I've continued working with a couple of the women afterwards. It became crystal clear for me afterwards what to continue working on. What was still a sticky point? Was it, oh, yes, you still have pelvic pain and hormone issues. Let's explore that. Or the gut is still an issue. Let's explore that. But when someone starts in the beginning and they have all sorts of symptoms in all these domains, you're kind of drawing at straws. And so your efficiency as a clinician can be significantly decreased, and you may order more tests or recommend more supplements. And what this program did was no supplements, just food, just support. And from a cost standpoint, Andrew's program has gone up a little bit. And I didn't technically charge for my time, but the program itself, the 6-week program, is something like $400 to $500. So you start breaking down per week and per day, with no other added cost of supplements and things. And the lab work was something around $200. I mean, it's radical how much improvement people saw from a very efficient intervention that was had great value, and it's going to improve our work as clinicians. And I think as we start to generate gold standards of what people should do or best practices, I would almost feel like I would be taking someone's money if I had them jump in immediately with all those problems to a very rigorous functional medicine protocol without doing lifestyle approach, having, say, a health coach in a community to support them to see what might get better and help us to be more tailored and targeted and save you time and save you money. So this is potentially, to me, clinically game-changing. And while it's just a pilot study in the functional medicine community, we have to use this as information to do more studies, but also improve our clinical practice so that we can become better clinicians and don't do wasteful medicine.
And additionally, it's not an either or kind of a thing. It's not like, it creeps me out or it freaks me out when I have patients that have been diagnosed with cancer and they come to me saying, hey, what can I do naturally to not go through the conventional treatment? And I'm like, well, it's not an either or. There's no alternative medicine. There is only medicine, and for certain types of cancer, there's no alternative. You either have surgery and chemotherapy and those things. We can support with other interventions, but we need to continue doing what has the best evidence. With this, it's not like an alternative to Hashimoto's. It should be in combination to proper management of thyroid regulation. And it's not going to interfere with my care. And God, it's not like someone's gonna go to an endocrinologist and they're gonna be like, hey, we're doing this levothyroxine. I also want to do this AIP protocol. It wouldn't surprise me if an endocrinologist just says, oh, no, there's nothing, that. But, it's not an either or. You should continue treating your thyroid and controlling those TSH levels. But at the same time, why not try something to improve your chances at better outcomes?
Totally 100% agree.
So what are the limitations of the study? We're getting really long-winded. It's been an hour and 10 minutes, but I do want to try to talk about this because there has been some chatter on the interwebs about this is only, a very small group of people and it doesn't mean anything, blah, blah, blah. What are some of the limitations?
Well, you just hit on some of them right there, and we've kind of discussed some of them throughout the podcast. One of them was that it was a very small sample size. We only had 17 people, and we finished with 16. So, if you were to have a much bigger population, say 1,000 people, would those results hold? We actually did get a pretty good sample size of the United States, and we were trying to filter people through the study. We actually did kind of select people across the United States. It wasn't just limited to one area. One of the criticisms was that, this wasn't a worldwide population sample. Well, no, duh, we only had 17 people enter the study. So, perhaps we could try to get the entire world population in future studies, but that's also really something that's not realistic from almost any sort of scientific standpoint. Most studies aren't looking at worldwide populations. The fact that we looked at a specific age group, however, as Robert said earlier, this was kind of that's a more common age range for people to be getting diagnosed with Hashimoto thyroiditis. It is more common in females of that age, so I think that was more of actually a strength, that we made it sort of clinically relevant. Another limitation was that some people thought that, the SF36 and the MSQ are subjective, but in my opinion, I think Rob will agree with this, is that it is subjective. However, it could be a strength because we're trying to improve people's quality of life, and quality of life is inherently subjective. My quality of life might be different to yours, which might be different to Rob. So if people are saying overall that their quality of life is improving, I want to be happy with that, and no matter how they quantify that. And the whole purpose of the SF36 and the MSQ is to try to get a quantifiable aspect to that subjective feeling. It's kind of like in depression, where clinicians will use a PHQ-2 followed by a PHQ-9, or if they have anxiety, a GAD-7. All three of those are questionnaires, and those are entirely subjective, but it's a way that we can sort of measure a response to a therapy for depression or anxiety. So although, yes, they are subjective, this is what we could use the most objective way to measure someone's subjectivity of quality of life. Rob, do you have anything else to add on to that, to do limitations?
Yeah, so like we talked about before the obvious one, we didn't have a control group, so we didn't have a way to sort of control for expectancy, which was really costs. We didn't have that group because of study dynamics and the budget that we had for the study. So, but what's important with any of these limitations, and what Adam talked about in the beginning, is it's kind of like, some of the criticisms. My analogy is like, it's like criticizing a tomato for being red. It's like, we knew in the beginning, this is what this study was. This is what this study could say. The only real criticisms would be if you did some statistical methods that were just completely erroneous, or made conclusions that were way too far-reaching for your population. And so I feel pretty strongly that based on the conclusions and what we've talked about today, we employed very strict statistical methods. We made very reasonable conclusions. We aren't trying to change clinical practice for every single person. We didn't go say AIP cures cancer. AIP is, the godsend. We talked about the multidisciplinary nature of the intervention, how we couldn't really say which aspect worked, but that given these pretty big improvements, we should study it in larger populations. So as long as you make reasonable conclusions, to me, as a scientist, you look at that and you're like, yeah, okay, that's a tomato. I'm not going to criticize it for being red. And, Adam used the terms too as a rough draft. We wanted to figure out, well, what's a good marker to measure? And the fact that we started to see some trend towards potential decrease in that inflammatory marker tells me I want to include that marker the next time we do a study, because maybe in a larger population, different intervention, we see either it's just statistical noise, it wasn't a real thing, or it is a real thing. And so by keeping your conclusions reasonable based off the study design, you avoid what I would see as actually reasonable criticisms or criticisms beyond just what's inherent to the study design. And so, a lot of the things that came out, some of the comments people made were just fairly lazy criticisms. But look, the process, and you get this as a scientist, no one goes into science like avoiding criticism. Like, we need that to get better. We need to go through the process. And we had some really helpful peer reviews to really enhance the study and make it as robust and as strong as possible, recognizing that it wasn't going to be perfect. No studies are perfect.
And, I've mentioned before, some people use science as a battering club to just squash their competition. Or you can use science to advance it, and I'd rather use it to advance it. I got a lot of criticism about, my studies, being in vitro. Well, there were no other studies done ever in the history of the universe that tested my hypotheses. So it's not like I'm just going to buy a shit ton of plants, make a shit ton of tinctures, and start giving it to people without, having any idea. That would be bad. So you got to start somewhere, and you got to get this conversation going. And, this has been an amazing show because we kind of did two things. We talked about these really cool things that you guys did, but we also went through the paper in a very systematic way to kind of teach people, how to read a study or what a study means, or not to make conclusions, and how hyper aware we are that this is the beginning. But we have to start somewhere. So, anyone listening to the show, get involved. Try to either, be science literate, go to your library and try to learn how to read a paper, how to criticize a paper, how to understand what the people doing the paper were trying to do. Maybe get involved, any way that we can advance science, and not just sit behind our computer keyboard, shitting all over people that are trying to improve the world. I know Angie and you, Rob, and and me, we were all kind of pissed off that some people were criticizing it. I don't know if pissed off is the right word. I was more like upset that people think that we're trying to come to a conclusion that is years and years and years away. I see this pilot study and I see it as a step forward towards making this ancestral approach to life legitimate in the scientific microscope, okay? I don't think anyone is claiming that this is the cure for Hashimoto's. But people misrepresent or they try to get ahead of themselves, and that is not the purpose of all of this. And that's why I felt it very super important for me to with my platform try to get some clarity into what this study means and how to interpret the results. So thank you so much, guys, for all you do. I can't wait to see more results from your branch of this ancestral sphere, and and anything that I can do to help you guys. I'm always here for you.
That's great.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kimo, for letting us come on and to dig more into the nuance, because it takes time not just to do the study, but it also takes time to really explore what was in the study and that process. And I am all for increasing science literacy and what I call the citizen scientists. We all need to be discerning. And I see that too, saying that folks in our own community, don't just take this as an echo chamber. Don't just take this study and say, oh yeah, AIP can do this. Don't just take our word for it, saying that we said it. Go look at the study for yourself. Make your own conclusions. Look at the numbers. And I also put in case studies for every single participant for a reason, because the individual stories matter. And so read those. Look at what the person started with. Look at what they did. But look at the study for yourself and make your own conclusions. It's not a bad thing to say, I think I would have said something differently based off of what's here. We need that. We need that discussion. But being lazy and sitting behind a computer and just saying, oh, you didn't have blah, blah, blah. It's just like you're not advancing anything. And this movement, if we're going to gain legitimacy and not stay in an echo chamber, is going to take those kinds of conversations. So thank you for promoting that, Guillermo, and for having us on to dig into that a little bit more.
Do you have something to add, Adam?
Oh, yeah, no, I was going to say, criticism is not necessarily something to shy away from in the scientific community. I think, criticizing and talking about studies are needed, because that's what continues the scientific process, and kind of, you're able to tease certain things out and try to make science better. So this way we can make, interventions and treatments better for the population or whoever's being affected by whatever disease or whatever's going on. But don't, like Rob was saying, and like you were saying, Dr. Ruiz, don't just lazily say, some comment or criticism without offering a solution or really understanding what the study was about. Criticism is welcome. Just make sure it's a valid point that you have.
How can people get a hold of you guys? How can people get a hold of the paper? Where can they reach this autoimmune paleo protocol, the hashtags and handles for the interwebs?
Yes, I mean, you can. People who listen to the podcast before know you can reach me at Scriptolist on Instagram, SCRIPTCOLIFT. A lot of hashtags can just be like hashtag autoimmune paleo, hashtag paleo, anything down that realm.
Hashtag sexy scientists.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, so I have a collaborative clinical practice in Charlottesville, Virginia, called Resilient Roots, Functional Evolutionary Medicine. I work with an amazing friend and partner, nutritionist Ryan Hall. So if you're a patient or want to become a patient, we are taking new patients and doing virtual care, so not just in Virginia. So that's where I'm based. And I have continued and will continue collaboration with Angie and Nikki through Autoimmune Wellness. And it was Angie Alt's programs to add to AIP and 6 that, as I mentioned before, we studied. So for folks who are really interested and want to maybe go through that program for themselves, that's what you want to type into Google. But you can find it on Autoimmune Wellness, and we'd certainly follow them. And we still kind of top secret, or we have another study in the works with Lucy Mailing, who is going to be studying. She's an amazing research scientist, about to get her PhD, but she's very gut-centric. So we have another study just about to launch, sort of similar kind of pilot design in a different study population. So really excited to be kind of being on the clinical side, working with her, but that's in the wings. So,
dude, I have her card staring at me right now. I need to contact her and have her on the show. So if you could send an email, if you could send an intro, because I met her at AHS in Bozeman last year, and I was like, oh, dude, we need to work. But if you could do an intro, that would be awesome.
Yes, Lucy is soon to be Dr. Mailing. She's brilliant. She's just wonderful. She's been writing for Chris Kresser for a while, and just does a great job of analyzing the literature. And so I'm putting a plug in for her. She's at like next gen medicine on Instagram. But yeah, follow her blog, follow her work.
Yeah, ngmedicine.com is her website.
Yeah, ngmedicine.com. She's brilliant, and we're going to be collaborating on the next study. I'll definitely get you connected.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to take any more of your beautiful Sunday. Thanks for coming, guys. I know this was like a little bit of like a rush in trying to get it produced, but thanks for your work, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Great.
Sounds good. Thanks, brother.